Hi everybody, thanks for coming. We are so Barnhill today. I don't know if you heard me say that Kelly's one of our first authors back in person. When they first contacted us, I don't know how many months ago, we were, hi, there's two seats here. And we were just like, oh, are we actually ever going to be able to meet again? And we knew that you kids didn't want to see yet another Zoom presentation. So we are so thrilled to have Kelly here. Now, she's going to be talking to us today about her new book, The Ogress and the Orphans. But I think everyone's here because you love the girl in the moon, right? So let us give a big Montclair welcome to Kelly and thank you for coming.
Okay, so I just want to take a poll of the parents. It's easier for me to read without my mask on, but I won't do it if you guys. I just took a test today. But do you mind if I'm standing this far away from you and without it? Is that okay? Okay. I just wanted to make sure. I wanted to make sure that everybody feels. If only one person didn't feel comfortable, I wouldn't have done it. Anyway, thank you guys. I'll put it back on when it's time to do signing when I'm closer to all of you. Hello! I'm so pleased that you're here. This is fantastic. Oh, is that good? Everybody's good now? Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I know. Yeah, the sun. Yeah. That's fine. It is a beautiful day. It is snowing at home, so I'm happy to be here. I went for a run in Central Park, and there's like flowers. What? It's amazing. So I'm so pleased to be here. I'm here because I have a new book, and it is a book that I wrote by accident, and this is true. I didn't think that I would write another book after A Girl Who Drank the Moon. It's true. I really thought that, and this book came in a kind of in fits and starts from a very strange place in my mind and my heart and in how I was thinking about the world and how the world felt like it was changing. And I started doing a lot of thinking about this concept of being a neighbor. There's a little couch right there if you want to squish in together. Thank you. Perfect. Hi, welcome. I'm so glad you could come. Anyway, yeah, I think right over there. I feel like I need to direct because I'm the oldest of a big family, and also I kind of am in mom mode, and also I used to be a teacher, so all of those things come together like, oh, are you comfortable? Should we shift these chairs slightly over to the left? I don't know. Anyway, so I was thinking about this idea of what it means to be a neighbor. And what does neighborliness mean? And what do we owe to our neighbors? What do we owe to our neighbors? Was something that I was thinking about quite a lot. I didn't think I was going to write another book. I had written The Girl Who Drank the Moon, which I know some of you have written or have read, and that book came from a very deep part in my heart and my soul. As I was thinking about growing up. And about parenting and about family and the very strange shapes that a family can take. But in the run up to the publication of that book, one of my children got very, very sick, and my life became taking care of my family and going back and forth to clinics and doctor appointments and hospital visits and all kinds of things. When you have a kid with a very serious illness, like that becomes your whole life. And so the book was going to come out, and I showed up when I had to, but I just said, you know what? I'm not going to read any of the reviews. I can't be part of any of I can't think about it at all. And I didn't think about it very much. So when it won the Newbery, it was kind of a surprise. It was kind of a surprise for me. And but you guys are kids. Most of you are kids. I'm not talking to the grown-ups. I'm just talking to you kids. Sometimes it has probably happened to you when something really great happened to you, right? Something like that you didn't expect. And sometimes you might feel like, oh, I might not have deserved that. right? We call that imposter syndrome. And that happens to a lot of people, including grown-ups and including me. And so I thought, you know what? I better not write any more books. And that's what I thought. But some things started to change in the whole world. And you guys have probably noticed sometimes that when your parents have their phones and they're looking at the news and they get this like crinkled face, right? I used to call my phone the rectangle of doom. And it felt to me that the news was getting really bad. And it was getting meaner, right? The news was getting mean. And I was noticing that people were using cruelty as a way of enlarging themselves and embiggening themselves, and a way of making money and of getting themselves interviewed on certain news stations, for example, right? And it was really hurting me. It was really hurting me in my heart, and making me really sad. And so I did something that I always do when I'm having a hard time in the world, when I'm having a hard time just generally. I started writing fairy tales. Now, I've been writing fairy tales since I was a really little kid. I love fairy tales. I was a delayed reader as a kid. It took me a little bit longer than kids in my class to come to reading. But when I did come to reading, I discovered fairy tales in a really big way. I'm the oldest of a big family, and so my job on Saturdays was to take my younger siblings and then whatever cousin was staying with us over to the library. And I would take the little red wagon and the big basket, and we would return all the books that we had gotten the week before and get the new books and then go back. And I loved getting collections of fairy tales from all around the world. Because of that, I learned about this magical thing called interlibrary loan, and you can get library books from anywhere. Oh, it's so great. Later on, when I became a grown-up, I discovered that there's another Minnesota author named Anne Ursu, and I'm sure her books are here. She's wonderful. She wrote her newest book is called The Troubled Girls at Dragomir Academy. Really good. I might have blurbed it. Anyway, she grew up near that same library, the Walker Library, on the other side. We never knew each other as children, but we're the same age, so we like to say that we were raised by the same librarians. Anyway, so I started, whenever I'm having a hard time in my life, I start to write fairy tales. And I don't do them for anybody else, they're just for me. And it's the kind of fairy tales that you would expect. Two siblings out on a journey, for example, or the Mad Duke in the Tower, or the little old lady who's in the middle of the forest and you definitely want to share your lunch with her, otherwise things aren't going to go well for you, right? The person who forgets who they are, and they have to have the people who love them the most hold on to them very tightly to help them to remember. I would write these stories just on scratch paper, or like those piles of loose leaf paper, because the schools always like say that you need way more than you do, and now I've got a big milk crate full of loose leaf paper from my children growing up, and so I would just write it, I would read it out loud to myself, and then I would throw it away. I recycled because I'm not a monster, and because the purpose was not to keep them. The purpose was just to have the experience of writing. It was like making a chalk drawing, even though you know that the rains are going to come. And every day I did that. And it was really helpful to me. It was just a creative practice for me, like yoga, but not so sweaty. And one day I wrote one that felt a little bit different to me. Even like the sound that my pencil made felt different. I read it out loud and it resonated differently. It felt different in my mouth and in my chest. It felt different in my ear. And I read it out loud. My dog listened, because my dog's a very good listener. And I thought, oh, there's something here maybe. So I put it aside. I didn't put it in the recycling bin. I just left it on my desk, and I started to go and have the rest of my day. And later on that day, I came back to it and I was like, So I pulled out one of my moleskin notebooks. I have this large stack of them because I can't stop buying them. It's a huge problem. I grabbed a moleskin notebook and I made a new copy of it. And I kind of rounded out the edges a little bit. I kind of like asked questions and interrogated a little bit, and kind of like teased it out a little bit. And I read it out loud again. I thought, there's something else here. And so I shared it on I have a Slack group of lady authors. I made a new copy there. I typed it in, and again, sort of like rounded out the edges a little bit, teased it out a little bit more. And I was like, ladies, did I just write a picture book? Which is hilarious to me, that I thought that my 400-page novel was a picture book. Because it turns out I can't even spit in 500 words. It's an issue. And I said, you should probably show this to somebody. And so fortunately, I have an editor who's genius and who put me on the right path to writing this book and to figuring out where the story was and where the novel was and where it all would sit. And so I started doing a lot of experiments. All of my books, whenever I write a book, I always have to start with a box. I have to think about a novel for a long time before I can start to write. And so all kinds of things would go and live in that box. I have put in, I put on all kinds of things. I would do interviews with the characters. I would write paragraphs that pleased me, that I liked the sound of. I would write all kinds of like stuff about like the natural history of dragons or ogres or the history of this town, or various recipes for acorn bread. All kinds of stuff went into the box. When I finally, and I did a lot of experiments too in trying to figure out the telling of the story. I need two things before I can start a book. I need to be able to know what the language will sound like, what it will sound like out loud. It's really important to me. Again, I was a delayed reader, and my experience with stories as a child was out loud. My dad reading to me, my mom reading to me. I would get books on record from the library, and I would listen to those. I had a Fisher-Price record player that I had bought from a garage sale with my own babysitting money. And we shared rooms, and so my only place that I could be by myself was in the closet. And I listened to Treasure Island probably 500 times. And I love how stories sound. I love the experience of listening. So knowing what a story will sound like is really important to me. But also the land under their feet, what color the soil is, what grows, how storms come in, what time you have to plant different things is all very important to me. I'm a Midwesterner. We are fluent in weather. I can out-weather all of you. And don't even get me started. I've been watching the massive storm that is going from Texas all the way to northern Minnesota. It's hitting my state right now. It's a huge storm. Oh. It's the talk of the town. Anyway, so I need all of that. And so finally, when I really started to dig into the version of the story that is the closest to the one here, I finally got a sense of, again, the sound and the telling, and I started to make significant progress. And it was January of 2020. And things were about to change again, weren't they? Right? I was sitting there. I teach at Hamlin University, and it was our residency. And I'm listening to all of my wonderful colleagues give their wonderful lectures, and I was, writing this story and writing it down, and it was sort of getting bigger and bigger and bigger as I sat there writing it. And we knew that there was this virus that was far, far away, and we didn't think it would actually come here. Right? And meanwhile, I was writing this story about a town that had lost its heart and lost its way and kind of lost its mind and lost its sense of what it means to be a neighbor, how they became shut away and apart from one another. And then finally, in March, I was sharing my chapters with my writing group. I have a writing group. I'm the only a children's author, and everybody else are science fiction fantasy authors. So one of them won the Locus Award the year I was born. She's fantastic. And so they read the chapters up to the point when the ogress starts baking for her neighbors because she doesn't know what else to do. And one of the members, Lyda Morehouse, wonderful, wonderful science fiction author, she said, "This is how I feel. I don't know what else to do. I've been baking for days." And 4 days later, they shut the schools down and shut the state down. So it was a very strange time to be writing this book. As I was finishing this book, there was a terrible murder in my city, Minneapolis. And as a result, my whole city erupted in this expression of grief and pain and rage and frustration, and whole blocks burned down and things got broken, and it was a very difficult time. I don't live very far away from it. My whole house became filled with smoke. When everything calmed down, I did what a lot of people did. I found my work gloves, and I found some garbage bags, and I found some shovels, and I took my minivan over to Lake Street, the site of all of the destruction, and I started cleaning up. And lots of other cars from people from all around the city and in the suburbs had also come to that same place, and they were also cleaning up. And things started happening over the course of the day. A tent came up, and then another tent, and people started donating groceries because there were 2 grocery stores that had burned down, and that particular neighborhood is extremely dependent on public transportation. And so people started bringing bags of groceries over. They brought diapers over. They brought cleaning products over. They brought whatever they could think of. And there were several distribution sites. And then people started making art. There were lots of windows that were covered in plywood, and so people just brought art supplies, and they started making art, and there was art as far down the street as you could see. And I looked at all this, and I thought, none of this is gonna come on the news. This is not the story that people are going to see on their rectangles of doom, right? Or on their televisions or anything else. This expression of neighbors showing up. And so that's what was happening in the world while I was revising this book. I want to read you guys a little bit. I have to decide what I'm going to read. I'm definitely going to read this one because it was weird that revising this later on when things felt similar, and maybe I'll read you the little bit about the stone as well, and then I'll open it up to questions. How does that sound? That sound okay? Great, because the questions are always the best part. Okay, I'm going to read you chapter 3. It's called The Town. But first I should have a sip. Because we do get parched. This is also a story about a place called Stone in the Glen, which used to be a lovely town. Everybody said so. Stone in the Glen had been famous for its trees. Shade trees in the parks and blossoming trees in the walkways, fruit trees lining the neighborhood streets with limbs that bent under the weight of abundant harvest each season. Anyone, any neighbor or friend or visitor from far, far away could reach up when the time was right and simply help themselves. People filled their baskets with apricots and persimmons, cherries and plums, apples and pears, depending on the time of year. They cooked fruit into candies, which they perfected recipes for tarts and pies and jams. They cooked fruit into candies, which they kept next to their front doors to give out to neighborhood children as they walked by. The streets in Stone in the Glen were a thing to behold in those days. People walked slowly under blossoming or green or fruiting boughs, taking their time as they enjoyed the dappled shade. Each night, street sweepers and scrubbers washed the cobblestones clean. The lamps, made from blown glass and polished lovingly by hand, glittered at night like stars. The street signs hadn't gone missing back then, nor had the public art back when it was a lovely town. In those days, townspeople lounged in the promenades and the public square discussing literature or politics or philosophy or art. All roads in town led to the library, which had wide windows and tall shelves and deep cushions on the sofa, and which welcomed everyone, as libraries should. Pardon me. There were hand-bound books and modern books and ancient scrolls and even texts carved into stones. The librarians bustled this way and that, sorting and preserving and shelving and shushing, and even their shushes were lovely. Neighbors worked together to make soup for the sick or cookies for classrooms. They swarmed like worker bees every time a tree fell on a fence, or when a roof needed mending, or when somebody's mother had broken a leg. Neighbors cared for one another once upon a time, back when it was a lovely town. But then, one terrible night, the library burned. Different people remember terrible events differently. There were many stories explaining what happened that night in Stone in the Glen, and nearly all of them disagreed. Some insisted that it was a miscreant who started the fire, claiming that they heard footsteps echoing with sinister purpose, moving toward the vulnerable building and then scampering away once the flames erupted. Others swore they heard the wings of a dragon flying overhead. Dragons were more common in those days than they are now, after all, and who loves fire more than a dragon? Others shook their head. They said the fire had been inevitable. Old wood and old paper and the occasional candle left burning. A disaster waiting to happen, they said. Well, there was little consensus among the townsfolk about the fire's cause. Everyone was in perfect agreement about what happened next, how the bells rang in the middle of the night, and everyone from the oldest to the youngest raced from their beds, pulling coats over their night clothes and sliding their bare feet into galoshes. They ran through the darkened streets carrying buckets, following the billowing smoke and that awful firelight. The fire, they say, rose in great towers over the library, so bright it hurt their eyes to look at it. Heat poured from the building. Oh, sorry, I did that? No, I didn't. Heat poured from the building in great waves, crackling people's eyelashes and shriveling the leaves in nearby trees. Books flew from the melting windows like panicked birds, their wings bright and phosphorescent. They were beautiful for a moment, the town remembers, the way a heart is beautiful in the moment before it breaks. The people of Stone in the Glen arranged themselves into a line. Desperately passing buckets, throwing water onto the flames. It was a useless exercise. The fire was too big. The wood beams were too dry, and paper has no choice but to burn. For years after, the burned library remained in place, a tangle of ash and old metal and fallen charred stones. No one had the heart to clear the debris away. No one could bear to touch a single stone. When they walked by, they held their breath. The children of the orphan house grew up next door to the remains of the library. They could smell the smoke and ash. At night, the ghosts of old books haunted their dreams. After the library burned, the town school too burned down. A tragic coincidence, people said. They held on to one another and grieved. Soon after, several other buildings burned down as well. Homes, shops, beloved spaces, and a rash of fires that lasted a little more than a year. After the fires, the fruit trees, and then the blossoming trees, and then the shade trees began to die off, one after another. A blight, people said, probably caused by the smoke, or maybe that terrible heat, or maybe it was just terrible luck. The people in town watched in sorrow as tree after tree came down, and with the trees died the shade. The light in Stone in the Glen became a constant, searing whiteness and difficult to bear. People squinted to look at one another, their faces creased into permanently angry expressions. Without the trees, there was no root system to soak up the rain, and Stone in the Glen began to experience damaging floods, one after another, which finally caused an enormous sinkhole to open up right in the beautiful park where the children used to play. There was no nearly swallowing it whole. It was too dangerous to play there anymore. Indeed, it started to feel too dangerous to play anywhere in Stone in the Glen. There was no shade. There were no trees to climb. The whole town seemed to scowl. Neighbors glared at one another with creased brows and narrowed eyes. And so people retreated into their homes. They stopped letting their children wander freely. They locked their doors and they latched their shutters. Shut away and apart, they stopped thinking about their neighbors and stopped helping their neighbors. There was no more soup for the sick, no more cookies for classrooms. Well, that goes without saying, because there were no more classrooms. Best people thought that we keep to ourselves. And so they did. They peeked through their shutters at the empty streets with a great sadness in their hearts. It used to be such a lovely town, people say, but it isn't anymore. Not to bum you out or anything. I kind of want to read one last little bit, and then I'll open it up to questions, but I have to find it. Here we go. Okay. So this story is about a town that has lost its way, and about a town that has experienced a lot of calamities, right? We also have a family of orphans. There's 15 orphans living in the orphan house, too many for one house, which is why I alphabetized their names. And which was supposed to be just a placeholder for me, but then they were those names, and so I had to keep them. It's also about an ogress who comes to town wanting to do some good, right? She hears about the calamities of Stone in the Glen. She hears about the growing poverty and separation. And so she makes a little farm on the outside of town, and she just bakes for her neighbors and leaves things on their doorsteps. They have no idea who's doing this. And things start to go a little wonky for everybody, but I won't get into that right now. Instead, I'm just going to read to you about this stone. It is called Stone in the Glen for a reason. This is chapter 7. Also, I love this because all of the chapters have a crow carrying the chapter to you, the reader. There's a flock of crows that are extremely excellent. They will be the first to tell you this. They were really fun to write. And one of them is on the back. So one of the cool things about this cover is that the ogress is too big to fit. But this is the only crow that is named, and his name is Harold. And he is my favorite. He is my favorite. I have a nephew. I have a lot of nieces and nephews, but I have a nephew named Harold, who is 5. And I love him very, very much. But when I told him that I was writing a book, and there was a crow that I named after him, and the crow is named Harold, Harold was zero impressed with this information. However, now my brother is reading the story to his 4 little children, and now Harold is extremely interested, and he asks every time, "Is this a Harold chapter?" That's what he says. Chapter 7, the stone. Listen, there is an actual stone in the Glen, which is situated at the center of what was once an actual glen. The glen, once upon a time, before the town was built, was thick with trees, mostly oak and ash and sycamore. Ancient things they were, and so numerous you couldn't see past the wide trunks and the sprawling branches. That was a long time ago. Eventually, people came. And being people, they saw the utility in those long, straight trunks and those broad limbs and decided to use them to build homes, then furniture, then a school, and then the broad beams of fine buildings constructed sturdily so as to last many generations. They cut down the trees and they built the towns. They didn't ask the trees how they felt about it. This is not unusual, alas. The people who built the town did not notice the stone. And as time progressed, the people went on not noticing the stone. The stone insisted that it didn't mind. It mostly didn't mind. People say that the posts and beams and pillars made from those original trees have memories. And not only that, but they say that each post, each beam, each pillar, each stick of furniture made from those original trees will sometimes whisper their stories late at night in the dark. Or at least so I've heard. I myself am not in the position to be able to sneak into people's homes at night to listen, so I cannot verify whether any of this is true. It's a pity, though. I remember those stories. While ash trees tend to be, I'm afraid to say, rather silly creatures, their stories often too vacuous and meandering to matter much, there is no better storyteller on earth than an oak tree. Long ago, before the town was built, when the original trees still grew here, the glen of Stone in the Glen rang with stories, and those stories had deep roots and wide, expansive arms and stretched outward and upward toward the sky. But that's all gone now. Every story fell with a blade of an axe. I still shudder at the memory of it. The stone remained. It wasn't going anywhere. Not that anyone noticed. Or mostly they didn't notice. The stone just sat off to the side of the center square. It was and is rough and asymmetrical and rather drab in color. It didn't seem at first glance to be so large a stone, perhaps the size of a comfortable chair, but in truth it was much bigger than it seemed, as much of the bulk extended deep under the earth and went in many different directions. How deep? How wide? Well, no one could say. No one but the stone. And stones don't talk. Usually. All anyone knew is that it could not be moved. Not for anything. If you were to travel to Stone in the Glen, and if you were to find the stone, and if you were to look very, very closely, you would see that the stone had writing on its surface. Much of it has been rubbed away years ago by the wind and rain and the touch of hands. And the writing that remains visible is in a language that no one has spoken for centuries. Since no one noticed the stone much, no one noticed the writing until that period of time after the library burned. People were wandering about in a state of grief and trauma and disbelief. It was in this state that their eyes fell on the stone. They told their neighbors to come and see. There was a symbol that some thought looked like a mountain. There was another symbol that a few remarked looked a little like a dragon. And there was another that looked like an oak tree felled by an axe. The more they looked, the more they saw. Well, I'll be, people said. Doesn't that just look like a house? And it did. Everyone agreed. And look, it's a village right there. And yes, it did look rather like a village if you squinted. But even more, when people placed their fingers on that symbol, they seemed that they could feel the village deep in their bones. And here, they pointed to another symbol. It's a fire. And indeed it was. The symbol itself was hot to the touch and for some reason filled everyone with a crushing sense of loss. And look over here, some people pointed out. It's an ogre. So many mysteries contained on this one stone. Word spread, people gathered, they sat by the stone and tried to untangle its many paradoxes. Theories developed, and then arguments about competing theories. A lively debate arose, along with spontaneous lectures, organized discussion groups, and even a sing-along for children. Ideas were swapped. It wasn't the same as having their library back, but it still felt nice to be together. Eventually, this sort of talk reached the ears of the mayor. He emerged from the fine doors of his great mansion, bathed as usual in golden light. He had beautifully coiffed hair and a dazzling smile. He glittered when he spoke. He defeated dragons, you know. He defeated so many dragons. It was difficult to say, he had been the mayor for quite some time now. It was difficult for people to say how long. Whenever anyone tried, it made their eyes begin to cross and their head hurt. What was time anyway, when you had so fine a mayor? The mayor frowned as he approached the crowd in the center square, where they discussed the meaning of the stone. Pray tell, he said, with a smile. His teeth were so white it hurt to look at them. Whatever is the meaning of all this? The former librarians discussed the text on the stone and their theories of its origin, while the unemployed linguists speculated on the roots and meanings of each symbol, and the teachers provide their thoughts on the scholastic applications for the stone and how it might be utilized in the classroom setting once a school was rebuilt. And the artists proposed a community installation, and the builders suggested a gazebo around the stone so that people could gather together and think and discuss and lounge in the shade. The mayor frowned. He reached out to touch the stone. Nothing happened for a moment. Then his face grew livid. And then alarmed, he pulled his hand away as though burned. If anyone had noticed the sudden change in the mayor's expression, no one said so. It's more likely that no one noticed anything at all. I did, of course, but no one noticed my noticing, and I'm used to that sort of thing. You see, one librarian began, but she was quickly cut off. Enough, the mayor said, with a click of his fine boots, his golden buckles flashing in the sun. The people in the center square had to shade their eyes. The mayor adjusted the drape of his excellent coat and inclined his face towards his adoring subjects. He shook his head. It pains me to see such disagreement on our beloved community. He pressed his hands to his heart and bowed his head in sorrow. The townsfolk gasped. It grieved them deeply to see their beautiful mayor in pain. Had they unknowingly become disagreeable? Each person cast a hard look at their neighbors. Mouths twitched, brows furrowed, and soon every face bore a sour expression. Without delay, the mayor ordered his carpenters to build a heavy wooden box to fit over the stone, to keep it out of sight and out of mind. The polished grain and skillful joints withstood the wind and weather for a good long time. Thanks to the box, people didn't see the stone anymore. As a result, they didn't really think about the stone anymore. In time, they forgot about it altogether. Eventually, though, wood rots and joints fail. Eventually, the box became a pile of cast-off lumber, one more broken thing in a rundown town. Eventually, more trash and more debris landed on the pile in the center square. People tut-tutted about it and complained about the mess, but they didn't think about where the mess had come from or why it was there. They still didn't notice the stone, which sat drab and ordinary in the shadow of the trash heap. Their eyes just slid right past it, as though it wasn't even there. Listen. What happened, you might wonder, when the mayor placed his hand on the stone? What happened when his expression changed? What, you might be wondering, did the mayor notice? Well, who could say? The mayor certainly didn't. You could ask the stone, of course, but I know what you're thinking. Stones don't talk. And you're right. They don't. Usually. Thank you. Okay. What do you want to know? I'll answer questions about this book or that book or any other book. I don't even have to have read it. You can ask about books in general or the world or science. I don't care. What do you want to know? Yes.
I just wanted to say that your writing really feels like it's going on right now.
Oh, thank you. You know, here's the thing though. There's this line from Scripture in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is, "There's nothing new under the sun," right? And sometimes I feel that way. There's nothing new under the sun. Everything that we see, we've seen before, and we'll probably see again, right? There have been other times when people lose their heart and lose their way. There are other times when, like, suddenly sort of mad ideas come around. You know, we just had it, we're still having a pandemic. There was another pandemic that happened a long time ago, and my great-grandfather died in it. And in the Spanish flu. He died. My great-grandmother caught it, and my great-aunt caught it too. And they didn't die, which is good for me because my great-grandmother was pregnant with my grandmother at the time. But we've seen these sorts of things before. Even sort of like people lauding a strong man, and that never goes well for anybody. Right? So I think that there definitely are some things in my book that feel like they could be happen now, but I think wait around a little bit and we'll probably see it again. You know? Great question. Thank you. Yes.
So you said that the thing that happened in your town sort of inspired Glenn and Rockin' the Glen?
Well, sort of. I mean, mostly. I mean, it happened after I finished the first draft, and so it was definitely in my mind when I was revising. But it wasn't just what happened in my city. It was also sort of I was noticing prior to that this sort of like lack of neighborliness and care, and it was upsetting to me at the time. So yeah. But what was interesting to me was that we do get kind of focused on that, and that there was this other story that was happening at the same time of neighbors that were showing up for each other. But that you didn't see that in the comments section of the newspaper, which you should never read unless you're a masochist. Oh God, it's terrible. Yeah.
What is your all-time favorite fairy tale?
Really great question. I mean, it's hard for me to pick. I love the Mother Hulda stories. So sometimes she's called Mother Hulda, sometimes she's called Mother Holga, sometimes she's called Old Mother Frost. There's a lot of different versions of the story. But that's the story of the two sisters, one good, one bad, and the good sister gets thrown down a well, and finds the well at the bottom of the well is not at all what she thought it would be. Instead, she finds a whole field of strawberries, and whereas up above it's wintertime, field of strawberries and a house and a little old woman who says to you, "Will you please share your bread with me?" And she does. And she said, "Will you please share your water with me?" And she does. And then she works for the lady for a long time. And then it's time for her to go back home, and and Mother Hulda gives her a gift where she gives her a kerchief that every time she puts it, there's a gold coin. She gives her an apron that also gives her gold coins, and then she gives her a pair of knitting needles that will never run out of thread, right? And so anyway, so she goes back, and the other sister's jealous, and then she goes down there, and Mother Hulda says, "Do you have something to eat?" And she's like, "No, I only have enough for myself." you know. Same with the water. And so she does not get any gifts. I really like that story a lot, primarily because one of the gifts is industry. She has her own means of being able to support herself. That's kind of cool to me. But I'll tell you what, I just, I love the story of the Firebird. This marvelous bird that is desired by tyrants and cruel men that can never be possessed, right? There's something really, I don't know, something very cool about that to me. But and also the story of the crane wife is one of my favorites. So lots of really great fairy tales. Yeah.
Are you thinking about writing another book?
Really great question. I often feel like the book that I just finished is my last book. So I do have my first novel for adults that's coming out in a couple of weeks. Another book that I wrote by accident. So that's called When Women Were Dragons, and that comes out on May 3rd. And then I also have a novella coming out like in December, I think. That's also for adults. It's probably the darkest and weirdest thing I've ever written in my whole life. And I wrote it entirely in an RV, going across the country. It all just sort of like poured out at once. A novella is kind of a fun form because it's not a novel, but it's it operates in a different way because it's shorter, but it's longer than a short story. They're kind of they're a very unique form. I really like writing them a lot. So I wrote another novella that came out a while ago, and now it is part of my collection of short stories. So, but I have a book that I'm working on. I have 3 books that I'm sort of kind of working on. So I have one book that's called The Sugar House that has Mother Hulda in it, actually. And it's a retelling of Hansel and Gretel, but it's set in Minneapolis, where I live, and in which the diabetic kid saves the day. But nobody will believe him because he almost accidentally burned down the school. Not really, but that's totally how it played in the media. So it's about this kid who tries to do the right thing. He makes really dumb mistakes. And everybody sees him through the lens of he's a bad kid and he's a bad boy. And people see him in kind of his actions in very outlandish ways, right? And kind of over-exaggerated ways. And so no matter what he does, he can't get off of his principal's list that he's been on since 3rd grade and whatever. But the thing is, he's not a bad boy. He's a really good kid. Like, he loves his kid brother, he loves his dad, he loves his uncles, he really loves them. He just makes stupid choices, right? And then one day something really scary moves into his neighborhood and kids start to go missing. And then how do you do the good and brave thing when you know that no matter what you do, people will see it through the lens of you're a bad boy and you're a bad kid, and probably whatever you do is going to land you back in juvie. Like, what do you do then? How do you do the brave thing then? So I've been working on that one for a really long time. And so I've been working on that. I also am working on a book called Dispatch from the Hideous Laboratories of Dr. Otto van Drecht. Which has an ex-pirate and a thwarted mathematician and a possibly sinister alchemist. And that's been fun because I've been doing a lot of research on the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs. I've been doing a lot of research into shipbuilding and map making. I've been doing a lot of research into alchemy and poison. So that's been fun. And then I've got one other book that also is contemporary and about a family, and that also has a rather marvelous baby goat. So anyway, that one's more niche. So all of my books have boxes, and they all have a lot of stuff in them, and all of my first drafts, I call it draft 0. And some books have several draft 0s. This one did, so things have to sort of be in that kind of nebulous place before I can start moving forward. So anyway, Great question. Thank you for that. It's always fun for me to tell the story of the Sugar House. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you share how you got your first book to be published?
Yeah.
What was that like?
That's a really good question. It's kind of interesting. I mean, when I first was writing, I didn't have a writing group. I didn't, I was sort of in that sort of throes of sort of the desperate time of motherhood, when like you feel like you're trying to like run an entire circus on the head of a pin, and so my only time to write was from 4 to 6 in the morning, and then at 6 I would wake up my oldest and get her ready for kindergarten, and then get everybody else organized and whatever. I do have the great fortune of living in Minnesota, where there's a lot of support for artists, and so one of the big steps for me was that I got a grant to cover childcare for my youngest, and so I had 3 hours a day that wasn't at 4 in the morning. The writing I did at 4 in the morning was not great, I will tell you that right now. And but one of the things about being a mom with little kids is that you don't realize how efficient you actually are, because you don't feel that way, because you just feel so desperate all the time. And when in fact, when I finally had, I used to just have the computer open, and I would like write something and then keep going, and then, in the middle of whatever. I once had a laptop burst into flames on my lap. Like there were terrible things that happened with soup, like immediately, whatever. And so like having sort of, a bunch of months where I was able to do that was really instrumental to me. I wrote a book, sort of a mystery novel that never was published, never will be published. You will never see it. Called Little Girl Blue. But I really liked it. I liked what I learned. And I had queried that, and it was sort of like getting nowhere. I have a lot of people reading it, but nobody wanted to represent it. I was like, what I'm learning here is I'm really good at writing query letters. And finally, I had this one agent who was just like, okay, I really like this book. I've read it 3 times, but I keep on having this like line in my head, right writer, wrong book. And I just feel like this is the wrong book for you. I feel like there's a different book that you're meant to write. So write me that one and I'll probably represent you. Unfortunately, I wrote a book that she doesn't represent, so that's fine. I went in a different direction. But that was like an amazing experience because it kind of set me free. And I had sort of been in this sort of like cycle of like sending letters and checking my email a million times. And so I had this sudden vision in my head of a kid sitting in the backseat of a rental car in that really strong rental car smell, with a sketchbook on his lap and broken glasses, and he was on a road going through Iowa, and the landscape spread out on either side of the road like a quilt, and the road was like this black ribbon. And I don't really have, I'm not a visual thinker. It's very rare for me to have like really strong visual images. I have 3 kids. I love them so much. It's work for me to get their faces in my head, but I have their voices in my head all the time. And he was so lonely. He was like the loneliest kid I'd ever seen. And so I just started writing this story to try to find a place for him to belong. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know I was writing a novel. I didn't know I was writing a novel for children. I didn't know I was writing a novel with magic in it. Those were all shocks to me as I moved along. But eventually I found my way through. And then eventually I sent it to an agent who called me like an hour later. Who was like, okay. And then that was it. I sold that book. She sold that book while I was teaching at I was doing a residency at a school up in Carlsbad, Minnesota, which is like 5 miles south of the Canadian border. And there's only one motel in the town that is also the town liquor store, and it was bear hunting season. And so my little tiny Toyota was like in between these giant trucks with like dead bears on it when I would come out. It was a very strange experience, but my agent was like calling, trying to get a hold of me, but nobody was answering at the motel because they were doing, bear hunter beer sales. And so finally, using the magic of Google, she figured out the school where I was and called the principal, who then informed the entire, all of the teachers, was like, okay, somebody's gonna call Kelly at this time in this classroom, and she's gonna sell her book. And so I finally get a hold of her from the classroom phone, and all these teachers are right there at the door. It's very exciting.
Wow.
Anyway, so that's that story. Anybody else want to know anything?
Good question.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of interesting listening to you just this past hour, talking about how you write and what you've written. You have these incredibly developed characters and this just vivid place. And so I'm curious, when you're throwing stuff in the box, what do you pull out first?
Nothing.
You pull out
Nothing. I pull out nothing. Yeah, it's mostly.
Well, what's first though, chicken or egg?
Oh, well, so that's a really good
Character
question.
or place for you?
Both. It's the same. And sound, it's all together. So I'm a runner, and when I run, I will. This is another creative practice. I will find a sentence that pleases me, and I will sort of it takes me a bit to find the sentence, but then okay, there it is. I'll have that sentence. And then I'll sort of go over it a few times. I'll make adjustments to it. Again, just focusing on the sound of it. And then I'll just start to add sentences to it, and I just go back around, and then another sentence, each sentence beads on a string, fitting them together. I can usually hold 2 to 3 pages of text in my head doing that. I come back, I write it down, and then I recycle it. I rarely keep it around, but every once in a while I'm just this feels like something. I feel like my subconscious was bringing me back over here to what's living here. But the purpose, it's not entirely true that I don't pull it out. It's sort of oh, my precious, it just is a place for my thoughts to live, right? And I'll kind of look at it and I'll piece through it, and it's very tactile, I'm a very tactile person. I don't think in pictures, but I do think in sensations. Which is why you'll often get the sort of the textures of things in my books, because that's how I ground myself and where I am. It's how I make space for the reader. So I'll sort of look through, and I will sometimes pull out a thing oh yeah, that was smart, good work, Barnhill, put it back in, or whatever. And so it's the same thing with my draft zeros, right? I will write a version, but then I put it away. I recompose from memory. That's also because of the time when a laptop burst into flames on my lap. And I lost 275 pages of a novel that I did not back up. The very nice Ukrainian man at the little computer repair shop at the University of Minnesota was very stern with me why I should not allow this to happen again. I brought him this melted thing. Is it possible to get anything out of that? He was like, no. It's not. But it was actually a really great experience for me, returning to that novel, and where just everything was sort of burned away. I felt like I was at this cusp of limitless space. I already knew the characters. I already knew the place. I already knew what was at stake. And I could simply re-experience telling that story in a much less encumbered way. It was really fun, actually, which is why I will often use my favorite revision technique, which is select all, delete, and starting over and recomposing from memory. The nice thing about my draft zeros, though, is that I can return to it, just be okay, well, how did I think about that? So I will go back and I will read through it, but I put it away when it's time to compose. Great question. Yeah.
Did you get injured?
What?
Did you get injured when the laptop
No, I didn't, but I moved very fast. So it was like sparks going this way. It was already like really hot. Like I was already, putting things under it. So I actually had a piece of lumber that I had on my lap that my laptop was on. And so it was very easy to take it outside. Get out of the way, children! So it was very exciting. It was a very exciting day in the Barnhill household. One that lives in everybody's memory. Remember that time when mom blah, blah, blah. Children for you. Anyway, awesome. You guys, this was awesome. You guys asked great questions. You were amazing. I'm gonna put my mask back on, and we can do some signing, and I will personalize and do whatever you want, but this way we can talk and we don't have to worry about your notes. So.